The Trump campaign of 2016 was full of consequential and surprising challenges to bipartisan orthodoxy. Much of that has been forgotten because his campaign and the first 2 years of his presidency were drowned by the CIA-manufactured Russiagate scandal and the accompanying Mueller investigation, while the latter part of his presidency and post-presidency have been dominated by the events of January 6th and various attempts to prosecute Trump or at least render him ineligible to run again. All of those scandals and that circus and those distractions served, I think at least partially by design, to obscure his very aberrational frontal attacks on the key prongs of bipartisan consensus, that two-party or uniparty dogma that has ruled Washington for years. Trump's ability to deliver to the Mitch McConnell-led establishment wing of the Republican Party their key priorities, tax cuts for large corporations and 3 solidly conservative Supreme Court judges, made them willing to go along with many of Trump's heterodox and sometimes threatening views, especially since they were often able to weaponize old-school establishment Republican figures from within, such as Mike Pompeo, Nikki Haley, and John Bolton, along with a string of career military officers who ended up embedded in the administration, such as John Kelly, James Mattis, and H.R. McMaster's, all to subvert many of the policy goals Trump wanted that were anathema to that D.C. consensus. But we should not allow that year-long D.C. war to either distract from Trump's abandonment of GOP orthodoxy or actively to subvert it, to make us forget how unexpected Trump's 2016 victory really was, and what a radical change it represented, not just stylistically, but to the long-standing prongs of core Republican ideology. Recall this now notorious clip of DC know-it-all insiders, such as ABC News' George Stephanopoulos and the New York Times' Maggie Haberman, just laughing in Keith Ellison's face after the Minnesota Democrat said he believed Donald Trump could win the Republican nomination.
All I want to say is that anybody, from the Democratic side of the fence who thinks that, who's terrified of the possibility of President Trump, better vote, better get active, better get involved, because this man has got some momentum, and we better be ready for the fact that he might be leading the Republican ticket.
Next, I know you don't believe that, but I want to go on to write it down.
Sorry to laugh.
Next
Hey,
week,
you know, George, we had Jesse Ventura in Minnesota win the governorship. Nobody thought he was going to win. I'm telling you, stranger things have happened.
Do you see how the people who are most authoritative and who are most smug about how in touch they are with the American voter, how much they know how the American political system works, just continuously are the people who are the most wrong? They couldn't even comprehend what Keith Ellison was saying, that people are so disgusted with the political system that they're being driven into the arms of people, unconventional candidates, like Jesse Ventura, and you could even put Barack Obama, when he ran in 2008, who postured the same way, into the arms of those people. They're so insulated and so entrenched in the idea that they understand how the rules of Washington work that they just couldn't even acknowledge the possibility that Donald Trump would end up winning the nomination. The same thing happened, exactly the same thing, over and over, including on Bill Maher's program, after Ann Coulter made a similar prediction. Not only Maher's audience, but the always wrong MSNBC host Joanne Reed, who's paid millions of dollars to talk about politics, regarded Coulter's prediction as evidence of insanity. Watch.
Okay, here we are. And which Republican candidate has the best chance of winning the general election?
Of the declared ones, right now, Donald Trump. I especially like
What about of all of them? I mean, Scott
fake
Walker?
laughter from the audience.
I mean, it's that same smug look, like she's insane, like they know everything, when they couldn't be more out of touch. Now, it wasn't just a handful of examples where that was illustrated, although those are some pretty representative shows I just showed you, not exactly obscure on the fringes. The consensus of the DC political and media class in both parties and on both sides of the ideological spectrum in 2015 and 2016 was that the rules of American democracy are simply rigged to ensure that the American presidency is available only to establishment figures like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, John McCain, Mitt Romney, all of whom believe in and affirm the same fundamental ideological precepts about both foreign and economic policy. And that's why they really did believe that it was inherently impossible for Trump to ascend to the American presidency, precisely because in so many ways he did not. Watch how many people reacted the same way.
There's not going to be a President Donald Trump. That's not going to happen.
Donald Trump will not become president.
He's not going to be president. He is not, Donald Trump is not going to be president of the United States. Take it to the bank.
Okay.
I guarantee it.
All right, all right.
I think if he becomes the president, he'll make it great, because the states is already great.
I think that man will be president of the United States right about the time that spaceships come down filled with dinosaurs and red capes.
On that note, Tom,
Take it from me. How about that?
Cheers, Tom.
And then, of course, there's Donald Trump. Donald Trump has been saying that he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising since I just assumed he was running as a joke.
Donald Trump, just last week, he confirmed to the National Review that he is again considering a run in 2016.
Do it. Do it. Look at me. Do it. I will personally write you a campaign check now on behalf of this country, which does not want you to be president, but which badly wants you to run.
So when you stand and deliver that State of the Union address, in no part of your mind or brain can you imagine Donald Trump standing up one day and delivering a State of the Union address?
Well, I can imagine it in a Saturday night skit. I continue to believe Mr. Trump will not be president.
He will never be president of the United States.
I mean, I could show you 10, 15, 20 minutes of similar things. Now, I found the most interesting and most amusing one, the example of John Oliver, a multi-million-dollar British-educated British citizen, British subject, who anointed himself explicitly spokesman for the American people. He said, the American people don't want your candidacy, but I do. I'm the comedian. I would love it. It'll be entertaining. Of course, you're never going to win. The American people hate you. They have no sense at all of how out of touch they are, how insulated they are in their elite culture. You can see it. Now, some of those examples may have been tactical, people insisting that Trump would never be president as a way to render him unpresidential. But I think most of it was sincere. American democracy has, in fact, all sorts of safeguards constructed to ensure that only those who affirm establishment power and perpetuate the status quo ascend to power. That's what it's designed to do. People who have been ensconced in Washington for decades understand that instinctively. They're like trained dogs who wear a shock collar that will inject them with pain if they wander outside the limits of the electrical fence outside their homes to make sure they don't wander away. At some point, quite quickly, those dogs learn where those limits are, and they obsequiously obey them because they have been trained on an instinctive level to know that any attempts to transgress those limits that have been imposed on them will result in pain and punishment. And at some point, you don't even need the shock collar anymore. The dogs just internalize their limits and submit to them. And that's how people in Washington are, the ones we just showed you. They have been trained where the limits are. They know where they are. And they know in their bones that nobody is permitted to go outside of those limits and still be politically viable. In 2013, then President Barack Obama spoke to the Wall Street Journal's Jerry Sieb, and he quite compellingly explained, Obama did, one of the key truths to understanding how Washington has functioned for decades. Namely, the idea that the two political parties are so radically different, can never agree on anything, are always at each other's throats, have fundamentally different ideological frameworks is fiction. It's theater. It's a script to placate the masses and make them believe American democracy is a never-ending war between two radically different camps, and that therefore you get to go and choose which of these fundamentally different camps will govern. Obama knew that the reality, at least before Trump, was the exact opposite. The establishment wings of both parties agree on most things. They're friends. There was just a clip just a couple weeks ago of Nancy Pelosi's daughter, who did a documentary on Nancy Pelosi, going onto The View and talking about how basically she considers George Bush her surrogate father. Because even though they fight, her mother and George Bush fight in front of the cameras, in reality they're extremely close friends, basically family. That's how the American elites have always seen one another. Obviously, Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, or Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy, have more in common with one another, as very wealthy, powerful Washington figures than they do with the vast majority of American people on whose behalf they claim to speak. They share the same fundamental framework for how the United States should be governed. Here's how Obama, I think, very compellingly explained it.
This, by the way, Jerry, I think is a good example of something that's been striking me about our politics for a while. When you go to other countries, the political divisions are so much more stark and wider. Here in America, the difference between Democrats and Republicans, we're fighting inside the 40-yard line. Maybe
you fooled most people on that in the last few months, I'd say.
No, well, no. I would distinguish between the rhetoric and the tactics versus the ideological differences. I mean, in most countries, you've got, people call me a socialist sometimes, but no, you got to meet real socialists. You'll have a sense of what a socialist is. I'm talking about lowering the corporate tax rate. My health care reform is based on the private marketplace. Stock market's looking pretty good last time I checked. And it is true that I'm concerned about growing inequality in our system, but nobody questions the efficacy of market economies in terms of producing wealth and innovation and keeping us competitive.
The establishment wings of both parties are just playing within the 40-yard lines, playing for a few yards of difference. The entire rest of the field is off limits from debate and challenge in Washington. They're out of bounds from the actual game and how it's played. And to the extent it looks different, because they're constantly hurling invective at one another, as Obama explained, that's just theater. That's done for political rhetoric, for political advantage. But the reality is exactly what he said. And that was indeed true of American politics for many, many decades. Any figure who stepped even slightly outside the bounds of establishment thought, such as George McGovern in 1972 or Barry Goldwater in 1964, were crushed, destroyed. They had no chance. And because Trump was so far outside of the boundaries of what could be said, not necessarily what could be done, that's always different, but what could be said, the well-trained people in Washington saw him outside of that fence. They've all been trained to stay within, and they concluded, I think sincerely, that he could never win. The rules they were taught and that they obey make that impossible. Now, we're less than 2 years from the 2024 election. We're never on this show, no matter how close we get to the election, we're never going to do horse race punditry. I find it vacuous and boring and pointless. But it is vital to ask whether the Trump era really ushered in radical changes in ideological beliefs, both on the level of leaders and voters, or whether Republican voters and leaders and even voters tolerated Trump despite those aberrations, and now are eager to return to a more traditional establishment Republican who resides well within those 40-yard lines, like John McCain and Mitt Romney did and like Mitch McConnell does. In a few minutes, we're going to speak with Josh Hammer, the opinion page editor of Newsweek, who had a great column early this week designed to ask whether Republicans' Trump-era changes in their views on foreign and economic policy were just a one-time only aberration dependent on Trump and his celebrity, and whether the Republican Party is now plotting to return to its pre-Trump establishment pieties by rejecting Trump in favor of a more traditional Republican candidate. But before doing that, I think it's vital to recall, before talking to Josh, just how heterodox was Trump's 2016 campaign. I remember the first time that I really paid a lot of attention to Donald Trump. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.